Story 1. It was a cold night, the kind where silence felt thick and alive. I'd just finished up with a patient at a small, quiet house tucked away in the middle of nowhere. I'd been a home nurse long enough to grow used to late nights and the eerie quiet that often followed a death. But that night, something felt wrong. I left a little after midnight, and my mind was heavy with the last image of the patient's face, twisted with pain and despair that no medication could ease. Her passing had been anything but peaceful. The highway stretched out in front of me, empty and endless, just me and the car's hum against the night. The road back to the office was one of those desolate, backcountry roads, where every few miles a lone streetlight fought against the darkness, only making things feel darker somehow. I was tired, but the kind of tired that goes bone deep, like I was dragging a weight around. As I drove, my instincts kicked in, and I checked my mirrors. I glanced at the driver's side mirror, and that's when I saw him, a man running alongside my car. At first, I thought maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. I blinked, but he was still there, his face illuminated in brief flashes by the passing headlights. I was going at least 60 miles per hour, and he kept pace effortlessly, his face blank until he turned towards me and smiled. It was an unnatural smile, stretched too wide, his teeth sharp against the darkness. "Go away," I muttered, my voice barely louder than a whisper, as if any louder and he'd hear me. But he kept smiling, his eyes never breaking away from mine. My heart pounded, and I could feel a chill creeping up my spine, a sensation like icy fingers pressing against my neck. I glanced back at the road, hoping it would be enough to make him disappear. But when I checked my passenger side mirror, my breath hitched. Blood was running down the inside of the passenger side window, thick and red, pooling at the bottom of the glass. It wasn't a trickle, but a solid sheet, sliding down in a slow, deliberate wave, like something out of a nightmare. The smell hit me, sharp and metallic, filling the car until it was suffocating. "No," I whispered, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles went white. "This isn't real. This isn't real." But I could see it. I could smell it. I had no idea where it was coming from, but it was there, undeniably and terrifyingly real. I whispered a prayer, one I'd heard somewhere along the way, a soft, urgent plea for protection. "Mother Earth, protect me. Send it away." I didn't even know if I believed in such things, but it was all I had in that moment. Somehow I found the strength to pull over. I could feel the presence, thick and dark, wrapping around me like a shadow that moved with purpose, pressing in closer with each second. My hands trembled as I stepped out of the car and walked to the grass, the earth cold beneath my bare feet. I closed my eyes and let myself feel it, the ground beneath me, the strength it held. Grounding, I'd heard it called, a way to send away what doesn't belong, to let the earth take the darkness. I dug my toes into the dirt, my heart still pounding, but a calm beginning to settle over me. I whispered again, "Mother Earth, take it away." The chill lifted, replaced by a strange, almost peaceful warmth. I stayed there for a moment, breathing in the night air, the smell of blood slowly dissipating, replaced by the familiar scent of wet earth. I could still feel the weight of something watching, but it was fading, retreating like a shadow in the sun. When I finally looked back at the car, the windows were clean, the air felt lighter, and the night returned to silence. But the feeling of eyes on me remained. I could almost hear a whisper on the wind, low and mocking. I got back in the car and drove, not daring to look in the mirrors again. I didn't need to. I could feel it. Whatever it was, it had been tied to my patient, that poor woman who died in such anguish. I didn't know what she'd suffered through in life, but it had been enough to leave a mark, a dark stain that hadn't left her, even in death. When I finally reached the office, it felt like an eternity had passed. I closed my eyes, whispering one last thank you to whatever had protected me that night. But the memory of that face, of that smile, and the blood pooling in my car's interior, that would stay with me. Story 2. It was a cold, overcast March afternoon, and as I arrived for my 1 p.m. shift as a tour guide at the museum, a chill ran down my spine. Not because of the temperature, but because of something I couldn't quite place. The morning guide rushed past me, barely even muttering a goodbye. Business was slow. Only one tour had shown up that morning, and with the dreary weather, I couldn't imagine a single person walking through the doors that afternoon. It should have been a peaceful shift, a quiet afternoon in a place I knew like the back of my hand. But from the moment I stepped inside, something felt wrong. Inside, the old infrared sensor over the main customer entrance gave a welcoming, faint buzz to count the guests who crossed through. Every time that bell sounded, a light flashed in the small gift shop, signaling me and the shop clerk that someone had arrived. But the entrance remained silent after I arrived, and no one followed me in. Only the whisper of the heater's hum filled the air. As the clock ticked past 1:30, I wandered over to the gift shop. The clerk, Wendy, greeted me with a nod. We chatted casually, but even our small talk had an edge, a quietness as if we were both on edge. The stillness weighed heavier than usual, a thickness pressing in from the shadows of the empty rooms beyond. About an hour later, at 2:30, the silence shattered. The employee entrance clicked open, and the bookkeeper, Ted, stepped in, shrugging off his coat and giving us a quick hello as he moved toward his office at the back. He didn't even look up until he was halfway across the floor, eyes locked on something by the glass doors. Ted froze mid-step, his face twisting into a puzzled frown as he turned to us. "Why's that chair by the door?" Wendy and I exchanged confused looks, both of us thinking he must have missing. But there it was, a black metal folding chair, standing directly in front of the glass entrance, facing outward. It was positioned like someone had been sitting there, staring outside, waiting. I felt the blood drain from my face. That chair belonged in the back storage room, 40 feet away from the entrance, and I hadn't moved it. I hadn't seen anyone else come in or out either. Wendy and I had been chatting right by the door the entire time, and the sensor had stayed silent. "Did, anyone come in while I was in the back?" I stammered, trying to make sense of it. "No," Wendy replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She was visibly shaken, her hands clutching the counter for support. "I've been here since you came in, and I didn't see a soul. No sensor went off either." Ted looked back and forth between us, clearly unnerved. "Maybe someone used the employee entrance?" he suggested, but even he didn't sound convinced. But that was impossible too. The employee entrance was locked, and only staff could open it. I had been near that door. If someone had walked in, I'd have seen them. Wendy would have heard. Yet somehow the chair had moved itself across the building and settled there, pointed straight out the glass like someone had been sitting there, watching. My pulse pounded in my ears. I forced myself to walk over to the chair, half expecting some explanation, some note, anything to make this make sense. I reached out, gingerly touched it, and it was ice cold. But not like the metal should have felt from the unheated storage. This was different, a bone-deep chill, as if the very essence of the chair had absorbed something unnatural. "Do you feel that?" I asked, but my voice trembled. Ted came over, hand hovering above it. He recoiled immediately, looking shaken. That's not normal. I don't know what that is, but it's not normal." Suddenly, Wendy shrieked, "Look!" She pointed wildly at the entrance, where a faint fog had started to creep in around the base of the doorframe, curling up like icy fingers. I stepped back, heart racing. We all stared, rooted in place, watching as the mist oozed slowly, purposefully. Ted finally snapped out of it. "We should probably go check the security footage," he muttered, already halfway down the hall toward the small monitoring room. Wendy and I scrambled after him, not wanting to be left alone with the inexplicable scene at the door. Inside the monitoring room, Ted brought up the footage for the main hall from when I had arrived. The camera showed me walking in, the morning guide leaving, Wendy at the counter, just as it had happened. Everything was normal. For a while, the three of us sat in that cramped room, staring at the footage in tense silence, fast-forwarding through the minutes we'd spent chatting in the gift shop. Then at exactly 2:30, something flickered on the screen. The image blurred, the faint outline of something shifting into view. It was the chair. It moved across the floor, slowly, jerkily, as if dragged by an invisible hand. My breath caught. There was no one there, not a single person, but the chair continued to slide forward, inch by inch, until it was placed squarely at the glass door, facing out. The screen went back to normal after that, showing Wendy, Ted, and me rushing out of the gift shop exactly as we had. "Did we just watch that?" Wendy whispered, her voice barely audible. Ted swallowed hard. "There's gotta be, maybe the footage glitched, or—" "No," I interrupted, knowing how desperate his excuses were. "I was right there, and that chair didn't move by itself. I would have seen it if something was pulling it." My mind raced, grasping for an explanation, something logical, but nothing fit. In a daze, we went back to the front. The mist had vanished, and the chair sat exactly where we'd left it, as though it had never moved at all. None of us dared to touch it this time. The museum felt colder than before, an oppressive silence pressing down on us, a silence that whispered of something unseen, something waiting. I didn't last much longer at that job. No one mentioned the chair again, but I never forgot that frigid, shadowed figure we couldn't see, the way the camera had flickered like it was fighting to show us something. Story 3. It was our third year in engineering, and the pressure had been relentless. Exams, projects, and the unending cycle of sleepless nights. We were on the brink of burnout, desperate for a break, anything to escape the grind. So we hatched a plan for a road trip. Madhya Pradesh's dense, ancient forests had always had an eerie allure, rumored to be a hotspot for the supernatural. None of us entirely believed the stories, but that night, maybe we were too stressed or tired to resist their pull. We wanted to escape and distract ourselves with something thrilling. We set out on a bitterly cold, moonless night. There were 5 of us packed into Akash's car, an old model with creaky doors and dim headlights. Abhishek sat at the wheel, and in the back seat were Meera, Karthik, Priya, and me. The drive was quiet at first. Only the hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires filled the silence. But as we went deeper into the forest, our voices grew louder, breaking the stillness with laughter and talk of ghostly legends. It was Meera who started it, of course. She had always been superstitious, fascinated by the paranormal. "You know," she began, her voice a whisper, "they say this forest is haunted. They say people have disappeared in here, and no one ever found them." Her eyes sparkled, a mix of fear and excitement. Karthik, the skeptic, rolled his eyes. "Come on, Meera. It's just a bunch of old wives' tales. Nothing more." But his voice didn't sound as steady as it usually did. We all laughed it off, but there was something unsettling about the way the forest seemed to close in around us. Darkness wrapped itself around the car, the trees towering like silent witnesses to our journey. I watched the headlights cut through the foggy road, revealing little more than the twisting path ahead. Every so often, a branch would snap, or the wind would rustle through the leaves, making us glance nervously at each other. Then we saw it, an old abandoned house just off the side of the road. Meera gasped, pointing it out. "Guys, we have to stop and check it out. This place looks haunting." "Are you crazy?" Priya shot back. "That place looks like it's ready to collapse." I wasn't thrilled with the idea either, but something about the house seemed to pull us in. It stood there, weathered and decrepit, half consumed by vines, with broken windows that stared back at us like hollow eyes. Against all better judgment, we decided to get out and have a look. We each grabbed our phones, using them as flashlights as we approached the house, our breaths visible in the cold air. The second we stepped inside, it was as though a cold hand closed around my chest. The house was silent, but the silence wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, thick with an eerie energy that seemed to hum just below the surface. The floorboards groaned beneath our weight, each step echoing through the empty rooms. I could feel something watching us, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. Just shadows. We spread out a bit, exploring different rooms, but no one wanted to go too far from the group. "Look at this," Priya whispered, drawing our attention to a wall covered in strange symbols and faded paintings. The figures were twisted and grotesque, faces contorted in agony. A chill ran down my spine. "What do you think these symbols mean?" Abhishek asked, keeping his voice low. "Probably just some old graffiti," Karthik muttered, but he sounded uneasy. "Nothing supernatural about it." Just as he said it, A sudden gust of icy wind blew through the room, though all the windows were closed. We exchanged looks, each of us feeling a growing sense of dread. That's when Priya noticed something on the floor, an old, dusty diary. She picked it up, flipping through the pages. Her face went pale as she started reading aloud. "This place belonged to an occultist," she whispered. "Someone who was trying to summon things. It talks about rituals, sacrifices." She trailed off, her eyes wide with horror. "He kept talking about how he could hear them whispering." Just then, we heard it too. A faint, chilling whisper, like the murmur of 100 voices coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. My heart hammered as we looked around, trying to pinpoint the source. But there was nothing, just darkness. "I think we should leave," I said, my voice barely a whisper. But when we turned to go, Abhishek's face went white. "The car," he choked out. I forgot to turn off the lights, and now the battery's dead." Panic set in. We were stranded, with no cell signal and no way out. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with a sinister energy that made my skin crawl. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and writhing, as though something unseen was moving just beyond the edge of our vision. Karthik tried to stay calm, mumbling reassurances, but even he looked terrified. We huddled together, instinctively moving closer, as though that would somehow protect us. The temperature dropped suddenly, and I could feel the cold seeping into my bones. I glanced at Priya, who looked like she was about to cry. Then Meera, her face pale and eyes wide, whispered, They're getting closer." "What are you talking about?" I hissed, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know, I just feel it. Something's here, watching us." The oppressive feeling intensified, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I could barely breathe, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. We needed to get out, but every time we moved, it felt like the shadows grew denser, as if something was actively blocking our way. In a last desperate attempt, Priya began reciting a prayer her grandmother had taught her. I joined in, my voice trembling. Slowly the whispers faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Then, as if by some miracle, the car engine roared to life, the sound breaking through the silence like a lifeline. We didn't waste a second. We sprinted out of the house and piled into the car. Abhishek slammed his foot on the gas, and we sped down the road, not daring to look back. I could still feel the chill, as though something had followed us, but I kept my gaze fixed ahead, too terrified to look in the rearview mirror. The ride back was silent, each of us lost in our thoughts, too shaken to speak. When we finally made it back to campus, we went our separate ways without a word, each of us knowing that we would never, ever discuss what had happened. It felt too real, too disturbing, as if speaking of it might somehow bring it back. To this day, I can still feel the chill of that night, and the whispers echo in my mind whenever I'm alone in the dark. I don't know what we encountered in that house, but I know one thing for certain. There are some places, some things, that are better left undisturbed. Story 4. I never used to believe in ghosts or hauntings. I'd always thought they were figments of overactive imaginations. But that all changed one night at my mom's house, the house she and my dad built almost 40 years ago. That house was filled with memories, but as I've come to realize, there was something darker lingering in the background, and it seemed tied to my mom's nightmares. The basement was cozy but old, with a massive brick fireplace that dominated the room. Over that fireplace, a large painting hung, one of my uncle's pieces, something abstract and dark. Mom and I were down there one evening, catching up, reminiscing about old times. The air felt thick, heavier than usual, and neither of us mentioned it, but we both sensed it. We sat there on the couch, nursing mugs of tea. Suddenly, my mom grew quiet, her eyes drifting toward that painting. She seemed uneasy, glancing at it like she expected it to move. I was about to ask what was on her mind when it happened. The painting didn't just fall, it shot off the wall like it was yanked by some unseen hand. It moved out, and I mean out. Not downward, and almost glided across the room, maintaining its height like someone had hurled it with force. I felt a chill down my spine, and for a second I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The painting finally dropped, landing just short of the hallway. Mom and I just stared, our mouths open, and the silence was almost deafening. My rational side kicked in, or at least tried to. I muttered, maybe the wire snapped or something, but I could barely bring myself to check. When I finally got the courage, I walked over, heart pounding, and inspected the wire, almost hoping to find it broken, to have an explanation. But the wire was intact, securely fastened. There was no reason, none at all, that it should have come off the wall like that. I turned to my mom, hoping for some look of reassurance, but she looked rattled, paler than I'd ever seen her. She shook her head, murmuring, It's happening again." "Again," I whispered, feeling that creeping dread building up. She nodded slowly. "It's like the house does things, strange things, whenever I start having those nightmares again. The kind where I wake up drenched in sweat and there's a shadow watching me." I didn't know what to say. My mom had always been pragmatic, steady, but hearing her talk about the house doing things made me question everything. This was no ordinary house. I didn't know if it was built on some cursed ground or if something had attached itself to the place over time, but whatever it was, it felt intelligent. Things had happened before. Lights would flicker off and on, seemingly at random, even though the wiring was fine. The TV would change channels on its own, landing on static-filled stations or some show with muffled voices that seemed to talk just under their breath, right on the edge of being understood. My mom mentioned that clocks would stop at strange hours, or that she'd hear footsteps in the hallway late at night, even though she lived alone. But this, seeing something physically move, was a different level of disturbing. I tried to joke, saying, "Maybe it's just Uncle's bad art coming back to haunt us." But the joke fell flat, and a shiver ran through me. I'd never felt so ungrounded, so terrified by something I couldn't rationalize away. That night I stayed in the guest room, but sleep was elusive. Every creak, every whisper of the wind seemed amplified. My mind kept wandering back to the land the house was built on. I'd read once that there had been a massacre of Native Americans nearby, just over the hill. A flash of what that could mean tore through my mind. Dark shapes lurking in shadows, ancient spirits wandering, clinging to the land with vengeance and sorrow. At around 3 in the morning, I was just starting to drift off when I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, right outside my door. My heart raced and I lay perfectly still, straining to hear. But just as quickly as they started, they stopped. Then a whisper. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was unmistakably angry. I could almost feel its breath on my face, even though no one was there. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to stop, willing the silence back. Minutes ticked by, each second dragging like an eternity, but eventually everything went still. The next morning I packed up, ready to leave. As I made my way to the front door, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. Turning around, I looked at the house, the windows staring back like dark, vacant eyes. And that's when I noticed it. That same painting that had flown off the wall was back in its place, hanging over the fireplace as if it had never moved. My stomach dropped. "Mom," I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "Did you put the painting back?" She stepped into the room, confusion etched on her face. "What are you talking about?" I pointed, and her face went pale. "I didn't put it back," she whispered, eyes wide with terror. I didn't stay long after that. We decided to keep the basement locked up, and Mom started sleeping with a nightlight on, something she hadn't done since she was a kid. I knew it was no real protection, but I couldn't blame her for trying. Story 5, I never believed in ghosts. Not really. Sure, I liked a good horror movie like anyone else, but to say I thought any of it was real? No way. That changed when my dad moved into what used to be a hospital, a place so old and decrepit, it felt like it carried the weight of 1,000 untold stories in its crumbling walls. His apartment was on the ground floor, the former morgue. Yeah, you heard me right, the morgue. Who in their right mind would live there? But rent was cheap, and he wasn't one to turn down a deal. The first time I stayed over, nothing happened. The building had that cold, sterile feeling you'd expect from a place where death was once handled on a daily basis. The air was heavy, the kind of heavy that presses on your chest and makes you feel like you're not alone even when you are. But I shrugged it off, attributing it to the building's age and its history. My family, though, they all had stories. Dad was the first to experience something. I remember the night he told me like it just happened yesterday. We were sitting in his living room, the one with the too low ceilings and dim, flickering lights that buzzed if you sat too long in silence. His girlfriend had just left for the night, and we were unwinding over a couple of beers. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing as if the walls had ears. "You know I don't believe in any of this crap, right?" He started, rubbing his hands together. "But last night something stood by my bed." I raised an eyebrow, skeptical as always. "Something? Like what? A burglar?" He shook his head, his face pale under the dim yellow light. "Number, not a burglar. It was just standing there, not moving. I thought I was dreaming at first, but when I blinked, it was still there, like a shadow that didn't belong, and then it just disappeared." I tried to laugh it off, make a joke, but the way he said it, the way his voice dropped into that low, shaky tone, I couldn't. There was a seriousness to his eyes that unnerved me. I wanted to say something witty, but nothing came. Instead, I just sipped my beer and let the silence swallow the room. A couple of weeks later, I was staying over again. It was late, past midnight. I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when I heard something. At first, I thought it was the pipes. Old buildings make weird noises, right? But then I realized it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the air vent above me. Voices. I froze, straining to hear. At first, it was muffled, like whispers that were almost too soft to make out. But as the minutes passed, they grew clearer. Two people, maybe more. They were speaking in another language. Something Slavic, maybe Polish, maybe Russian. I don't know. They were arguing, their voices rising and falling like a heated debate. Occasionally, one of them would burst into laughter, the sound echoing through the vent and filling my room. I sat up, staring at the vent as if I could somehow see through it. My mind raced. Was someone in the building? Maybe upstairs? But no, that didn't make sense. The layout of the place didn't have rooms above mine, at least not directly. And besides, who argues in another language at 4 a.m.? The arguing continued for what felt like hours. I couldn't sleep. I just lay there wide-eyed, my heart racing, listening to this bizarre conversation happening right above me. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Dead silence. I didn't hear a single word after that, but I didn't sleep either. The next morning, I asked Dad if he'd heard anything. He just shook his head, half smiling like he didn't believe me. But I know what I heard. That was just the beginning. A few weeks after that, my brother had his own encounter. He was home alone in his room when he heard a loud crash from the kitchen, pots and pans clattering like someone had pulled every single one out of the cabinets. He thought maybe Dad had come home, so he walked out to check. But the kitchen was empty. No one was there. Every cabinet door was wide open, and the pots and pans were scattered across the floor like someone had been cooking up a storm, but there wasn't a soul around. He told me later that the hairs on the back of his neck stood up the second he stepped into the room. Something wasn't right. It felt like the air had shifted, like the house was watching him, waiting for him to react. He didn't. He just quietly picked everything up, closed the cabinets, and went back to his room. He didn't sleep that night either. Dad's neighbor has his own story too. He swears there's an older couple who lives in his apartment. Not in the sense that they're tenants. No, he says they've been there for years. He's seen them, sitting together on the couch, standing in the doorway, walking down the hall like they're still living out their daily lives. The thing is, no one else has ever seen them. No one except for him, and he talks about them like they're real, like he's just gotten used to sharing his space with them. And then there was the dog's tennis ball. Dad and his girlfriend were sitting on the couch one night, watching TV, when out of nowhere, one of my dog's old tennis balls rolled across the floor. The thing is, my dog was fast asleep at Dad's feet. The ball didn't just roll like it had been nudged. It moved like someone had picked it up and thrown it. They both watched it in stunned silence. neither one wanting to say what they were both thinking. It wasn't long after that when I stopped staying over. The place was too much, too quiet in all the wrong ways, too alive when it shouldn't be. I don't know what happened in that hospital or why the dead seem to have stuck around, but I do know one thing. Whatever's in there isn't going anywhere. Story 6. I've never believed in the supernatural, ghosts, aliens, all of that. It was fun to joke about, sure, but I never took it seriously. Until one night, the night that still haunts me. Even now, years later, I can't make sense of it, no matter how much I've tried. It was the mid-2000s, and I was in my late 20s, living with my wife at the time in rural California. We were heading back home late one night from a dinner with some friends, the kind of night where you're so tired you start questioning your own decisions. Should we have stayed longer? Should we have left earlier? Should we have even gone? That kind of night. The weather had been fine all day, a typical warm California evening, but by the time we left, the fog had rolled in thick, thicker than I'd ever seen in my life. We stopped the car at the entrance to the only road leading into the town, and I remember my ex-wife turning to me, her voice shaky. "Do you think we should risk it?" I glanced at the road. It was a black ribbon disappearing into a wall of white. "I think we'll be fine," I said, trying to reassure both of us. But truth be told, I wasn't convinced. We didn't have many options, though. We couldn't stay where we were all night. Now, I have this weird habit of timing everything. It's not quite OCD, but close enough. I know for a fact that the drive from that entrance to our driveway always took between 23 and 28 minutes, depending on how fast I drove. The speed limit was 55 for most of the way and dropped to 45 for the last stretch. But that night, given how thick the fog was, we were crawling. I barely pressed the gas pedal, keeping it at 10 miles per hour at best. 15 minutes in, things got worse. The fog thickened to the point where we couldn't see the end of the car's hood. My ex-wife was gripping the seat, her knuckles white, and I wasn't far behind. I tried to stay calm, but the truth is, I was scared. "This is insane," she whispered, her breath fogging the windows even more. "We should pull over." But there was nowhere to pull over. No shoulder, no side road, just blackness, and then nothing. I dropped our speed to a crawl, barely moving. We were trapped in a cocoon of white. And then the strangest thing happened. It felt like the world disappeared. For a few seconds, we were weightless, like the car was floating in the air. I know how ridiculous that sounds, but I swear it's true. We both started screaming, not out of panic, but because it felt like we were going to plunge over the edge of something. It was that feeling you get when you miss a step on a staircase, only infinitely worse. Then just as suddenly as it came, the fog thinned. We could see the road again, barely, but it was enough. Enough to make us stop screaming, enough to get a grip. I picked up speed just a little, enough to feel like we were moving again. I kept my eyes glued to the road, my heart hammering in my chest. A couple minutes passed, maybe less. The fog continued to lift. My breathing slowed. My ex-wife muttered something about how close we'd come to crashing. But then I realized something that made my blood run cold. We were too far down the road. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard and felt my stomach drop. "What the hell?" I muttered, staring at the time. 23 minutes had passed, but that couldn't be. It wasn't possible. I checked the speedometer again. I hadn't been going faster than 10 miles per hour, maybe 15 miles per hour tops, and we'd barely been moving for most of the trip. There was no way we could have covered that much distance in that little time. "We're almost home," I said, more to myself than to her. She looked at me like I was crazy. "That's impossible." I checked the clock again. It was still ticking normally. I glanced outside, scanning the road for some sign, some proof that we hadn't skipped over time and space. But there it was, our street, just up ahead. Our driveway came into view within seconds, and I pulled in. My hands were shaking as I turned off the ignition. We both sat there in silence, staring at the house. Neither of us wanted to say it out loud. Neither of us wanted to acknowledge that something had just happened that defied explanation. "Check the time," she whispered, her voice almost too quiet to hear. I looked at the clock on the dashboard. Sure enough, 23 minutes, right on the dot. Impossible. We should have taken an hour at the very least, given how slow we'd been driving. I checked my phone, then the clock inside the house. Both said the same thing. 23 minutes had passed since we'd left the entrance to the road. We didn't talk about it that night. We barely talked at all, in fact. We went to bed, though neither of us slept. I could hear her tossing and turning beside me, and my own mind was racing. I kept trying to come up with some explanation. Maybe I misread the clock. Maybe we'd just been too freaked out to think straight. But I knew deep down that none of that made sense. The next day, I drove that road again, in daylight, trying to recreate what happened. I timed it again. 24 minutes, then 26. It always took between 23 and 28 minutes, just like before. No matter how hard I tried to make sense of it, I couldn't. We never talked about it again after that. But I think about it often. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I'll remember the way the world just disappeared around us. How time seemed to stop, or maybe speed up for just a moment. How we somehow covered more ground in 23 minutes than we should have been able to. To this day, I still don't know what happened on that foggy night. But I do know one thing. Whatever it wasn't natural. It wasn't right. And every time I think about it, I feel that same creeping dread crawl up my spine. Story 7. I live in a quiet little town, nestled at the edge of a sprawling forest. My house is one of those old, creaky things, the kind that groans when the wind blows too hard, and every once in a while, the pipes knock like someone's tapping at the walls. It's an eerie place at night, to say the least, the kind of place where the silence feels thick, almost oppressive, and any sound seems to echo louder than it should. But you get used to it after a while, until something happens that makes you rethink the nature of the silence. One weekend, I was home alone. It was late, and I was lying in bed, drifting between sleep and watching reruns on TV. My dog Bella was curled up next to me, snoring softly. The soft drone of the TV and her steady breathing had almost lulled me to sleep when she suddenly bolted upright, every muscle in her body tense. In a flash, she tore off the bed, barking wildly at the window facing the backyard. Now, Bella isn't the type to get riled up easily. She's never been one of those dogs who bark at every squirrel or passing car. So her sudden burst of energy threw me off. My heart jumped, and for a second I just sat there, frozen. The sound of her barking was fierce, like nothing I'd ever heard from her before. There was a strange primal edge to it, almost as if she was afraid. I shook off the grogginess and got up, heading toward the window. My backyard was bathed in darkness, but I could see her standing there, fur bristling, growling low in her throat at something just beyond the glass. I followed her gaze, peeking through the curtain. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was just a cat, a stray, or maybe a neighbor's pet. But there was something wrong, something deeply unsettling about this animal. It wasn't just the way its fur stood on end, like it had been electrocuted, spiked in all directions. It was its eyes. They weren't just reflecting light like normal cat eyes. They glowed, two perfect, round orbs of light, glowing in a way that felt unnatural, wrong. They weren't yellow or green, like you might expect. They were white, almost too bright, like two tiny headlights locked on me and Bella. I stared at it for a moment, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. Cats don't look like that, I thought. They just don't. Bella was still going berserk, her barks turning into those deep, guttural growls that made her sound much larger than she was. I'd never heard her make that kind of noise before. It sent a shiver down my spine. "What the hell?" I muttered under my breath. I moved closer to the window, trying to get a better look. The cat didn't move. It just stood there, staring, its glowing eyes boring into me. There was something about its stare that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just looking at me, it felt like it was seeing me, like it knew something, like it was waiting for something. Bella's growls grew louder, more frantic. I knew I had to do something to calm her down, so I reached out to pull the curtain fully shut. But as I did, I hesitated. I didn't want to lose sight of the cat. Some part of me needed to see what it would do next, as if closing the curtain would mean letting something terrible in. I took a deep breath and peeked out one last time. The cat was gone, just like that, in the blink of an eye. There wasn't even a rustle of leaves or the faintest sound of movement. 1 second it was there, and the next the space it occupied was empty. I stood there staring at the spot where it had been, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing in on me. Bella had stopped barking, but was still pacing restlessly, her tail low, her ears pinned back. She was clearly shaken. I pulled the curtain shut, trying to shake the unease crawling up my spine. I told myself it was just a weird-looking cat. Maybe the glow was a trick of the light or something. Maybe a car's headlights bounced off its eyes in a strange way. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. There was something wrong with that animal, something unnatural. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak, every groan of the house seemed louder than usual. I kept expecting to hear Bella start barking again, or to see those glowing eyes peering through the window. But the night passed uneventfully. The next morning I went out into the backyard to look around. I didn't really know what I was expecting to find. Maybe some paw prints in the dirt, or some sign that the cat had been there at all. But there was nothing. The ground was undisturbed, the bushes hadn't been trampled. It was like the whole thing had never happened. But Bella knew. She avoided the window for days afterward, refusing to go near it even when I called her. She would just sit in the corner, staring at it warily, as if she expected that cat to reappear at any moment. I've told a few people about what I saw, but no one really believes me. They laugh it off or say I was probably half asleep, imagining things. But I know what I saw, and Bella knows it too. It wasn't just a cat. There was something wrong with it, something I still can't explain. And even though I've never seen it again, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching, waiting. Sometimes at night, when the house is especially quiet, I catch Bella staring at the window again, her eyes filled with that same unease, and I can't help but wonder if one day those glowing eyes will return. Only this time, they won't just be watching from the yard. Story 8. It was one of those sticky, thick nights in June 2014. My mom, grandma, and I were living in this creaky old rental house. A bit run down, sure, but it had character. Most nights the place was quiet, except for the occasional groan of wood shifting. Nothing I hadn't gotten used to, but that night was different. Something about it felt heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on me. I didn't know it yet, but that night would haunt me for years. It was around 2 a.m. I'd been lying on the couch, scrolling through my phone, feeling too wired to sleep but exhausted. Eventually, I gave in and headed upstairs. My room was tucked away at the end of the hall, and as usual, I went through my nightly routine, brushed my teeth, washed my face, turned on the lamp next to my bed. Just normal stuff. When I finally crawled under the covers, I was out almost immediately, sinking into that foggy space between wakefulness and sleep. But then, just as I was slipping away, a floorboard creaked. I shrugged it off. Old houses make sounds, but the creak was right at the foot of my bed. I cracked open one eye, and what I saw there jolted me awake in an instant. Standing at the edge of my bed, perfectly still, was my grandma. She was dressed in a way I hadn't seen her in years, like she was ready for church or some grand event. She wore this dress I vaguely recognized. Her hair was done up, and she even had her jewelry on. I blinked, sure I must be dreaming. "Grandma?" I mumbled, confused. She stared at me with a blank, empty expression, like she didn't recognize me. Then, without moving her lips, I heard her voice. "You need to get up. We're going to be late." I sat up, every bit of sleep vanishing from my mind, my pulse pounding. "Late? For what?" I said, trying to sound annoyed to hide the fear creeping up my spine. "It's after 2 in the morning." No response. She just stood there, staring with those strange, hollow eyes, the light from the lamp casting long shadows across her face. My irritation grew into something darker, and I reached over to turn the lamp on. But the moment my hand touched the switch, she was gone. The room was silent again, too silent. I could feel my heart hammering, every inch of me on edge. I turned the lamp on and stared at the empty space where she'd just been, trying to make sense of it. In a house as small as ours, there was no way for someone to disappear like that. I got out of bed, a surge of anger rising in me. Maybe she'd been playing a prank, though that wasn't like her. but I needed answers. Now I crossed the hall to her room, half expecting to find her standing just behind the door, waiting to scare me. I pushed the door open, already preparing to let her know exactly what I thought of this creepy little game. But there she was, lying in bed, snoring softly, her TV playing an infomercial for kitchen knives. She was out cold, her hair a frizzy mess, wearing her old pajamas. Not even close to what I'd just seen. I felt my stomach drop. It was physically impossible for her to be dressed up, in my room and then asleep in bed in the span of seconds. I stood there frozen, staring at her and waiting, half expecting her eyes to snap open, or for her to sit up and laugh like she'd somehow pull off this grand prank. But she just lay there oblivious, as if none of it had happened. I stumbled back, the walls around me feeling too close. I kept replaying the moment in my head, her voice, that dead-eyed stare, her jewelry glinting in the dim light. None of it made sense. I pressed my hand to my mouth to keep from gasping, or worse, screaming. I knew then that whatever I'd just seen wasn't my grandmother. It was something else, something that had chosen her face, her voice. It had known her voice. I staggered back to my room, the air feeling colder than it had just moments before. Every shadow seemed longer, every sound magnified. I crawled under my blankets, too afraid to even reach for the lamp. Sleep was out of the question, so I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening for another sound, a footstep, a whisper. The hours crawled by. Finally, as dawn began to break, the first light spilling into the room, I felt a hint of relief. I'd made it through the night without any other visits. When morning came, I was out of bed, barely awake but too on edge to care. My mom and grandma were in the kitchen, chatting over coffee like any other morning, and I couldn't bring myself to mention what had happened. I was scared of what they'd say, or worse, what they wouldn't. Days turned into weeks, and I tried to shake it off as a bad dream, a trick of my tired mind. But every night, I couldn't help but feel like something was watching, something that had used my grandma's face like a mask. By the end of 2015, I couldn't stand it anymore. I moved out, hoping that distance would be enough to finally rid myself of the memory. Mom and Grandma stayed in that house until 2021, acting like nothing had ever been wrong. But sometimes I wonder if either of them ever felt it. That heavy, silent presence, lurking just out of sight. Or if, maybe, they were better off never knowing at all. Story 9. My name is Shruti Gupta, and I grew up in Agra, a city known for its rich history and crowded streets, nestled along the Yamuna River. But the story I'm about to tell is something I rarely share. It feels both real and unexplainable, a strange blur between reality and something else entirely. It's haunted me for years, and I'm not sure I'll ever fully shake it. Back in my school days, I used to attend early morning tuition classes with a very popular, almost legendary math tutor in our town. He was brilliant, and his classes were always packed. He was so in demand, in fact, that he'd begin his first class at 5:30 a.m. sharp. This meant dragging myself out of bed in the dead of winter, leaving my warm blankets behind while my family remained fast asleep. The streets were always eerily quiet, the cold gripping the air like a silent warning. A close friend of mine also attended these classes, and we'd meet at the same spot each morning. The morgue. Yes, the morgue. You see, we both lived near a hospital and there was no other shortcut. Walking through that path became a routine, though people often whispered about the place, complaining of strange sightings and eerie noises. But we brushed it off. We were young and fearless, or so I thought. One morning, I remember waking up with a start. I felt a surge of panic, thinking I'd overslept. Without even glancing at the clock, I threw on my hoodie, grabbed my bag, and rushed out into the icy darkness. The streets were empty, still cloaked in shadows, with only the occasional streetlight casting long, ghostly shapes across the road. As usual, I reached the morgue and found my friend waiting. He was wearing a hoodie, his face mostly obscured in the dim light, but I could recognize his familiar stance. I greeted him with a quiet nod, and we walked in silence, the only sound our footsteps on the deserted road. The chill in the air felt heavier than usual, like it was pressing down on us, muffling everything around. Something about that morning felt different, strange, but I couldn't put my finger on it. As we approached the tutor's house, my friend suddenly stopped. I turned to him, confused. "Come on," I said, motioning for him to follow, but he just shook his head. "I have to go," he murmured, his voice low and almost unfamiliar. It was odd, but I didn't think much of it. Maybe he had something urgent to handle. "All right, see you in class," I replied, brushing it off and heading to the tutor's gate alone. I rang the bell, and after a few moments, the tutor came to the door, looking groggy and surprised. "Shruti, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice laced with confusion. "What do you mean?" "I'm here for class," I replied, equally puzzled. "Shruti, it's 3:30 a.m., he said, glancing at his watch and frowning. "Go home. It's way too early." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt a wave of cold dread wash over me. It couldn't be. I hadn't even checked the time before leaving. Apologizing quickly, I stumbled back, my mind reeling. As I walked away from the house, the street seemed darker, the silence more oppressive. I tried to calm myself, to make sense of what had just happened. When I got home, I threw myself into bed, clutching the covers and hoping sleep would find me. But my mind was buzzing with questions. Who had I walked with? And why had he disappeared so abruptly? The next morning, as soon as it was a reasonable hour, I called my friend. I tried to laugh it off, explaining how we'd accidentally shown up at the tutor's house at 3:30, but there was silence on the other end of the line. "What are you talking about?" he asked, sounding genuinely confused. I hesitated. "You know, we met up, walked together. You left me at the tutor's gate. Remember?" He was quiet for a moment, then spoke, his voice a strange mix of confusion and concern. "Shruti, I didn't meet you this morning. I was sleeping. I haven't left my house yet." A chill crept up my spine, settling like ice in my veins. He sounded sincere, almost frightened. I laughed nervously, hoping he was just messing with me. But his voice remained steady, earnest. He hadn't been there. According to him, he hadn't left his bed. I barely remember the rest of our conversation. My hands shook as I put the phone down, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and dread. If he hadn't been with me, who had? The thought was terrifying. I couldn't shake the image of that figure walking beside me, his hood pulled low, his face hidden in the shadows. Every detail came rushing back, clearer than ever. His silence, the strange tone in his voice when he said he had to go, the sense of unease I'd ignored. I tried telling myself it was a prank, some elaborate joke to scare me, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Whatever had happened that morning was something else entirely, something I couldn't explain, and the more I thought about it, the more frightened I became. When I told my parents, they exchanged worried looks. My mother immediately called a pandichi, and soon after, he arrived to perform a puja in our house. As he chanted and moved around our home, the fear I'd been holding back seemed to seep into every corner, filling the air with a heavy, ominous energy. My parents believed the puja would drive away any lingering spirits, but for me, it offered little comfort. The nights after that were restless, filled with broken sleep and strange dreams. I'd see that dark figure waiting by the morgue, his face hidden, watching me. Every morning felt like a struggle, the world around me slightly off-kilter, as if reality had shifted in ways I couldn't fully grasp. Years have passed, but I still think about that morning sometimes. The image of that figure walking silently beside me, his identity a mystery, his purpose unknown. It's a memory I carry, a lingering fear that creeps back on dark, quiet nights. I've learned to live with it, to let it settle in the corners of my mind, but it's always there, waiting. Some things, I've come to believe, are simply beyond explanation. And while part of me wants to know who or what I encountered that morning, another part hopes I never find out. Story 10. I grew up on the outskirts of a small town where the nights were as thick as the shadows that crept along the dirt roads. At 25, I found myself looking after a friend's sprawling farm, a mix of rolling fields and ominous stretches of woods that whispered secrets I never dared to uncover. My days were spent in the routine of my day job, but as the sun sank below the horizon, I traded the bustle of the world for the silence of the land. Every night I'd return, headlights cutting through the darkness as I approached the gate. The farm was alive with the low sounds of nature, but I always felt that creeping sense of unease. The dogs, 9 of them, were my only companions as I sat in my car, waiting for them to greet me. They would swarm around my vehicle, their breath misting in the cool night air, tails wagging in anticipation. It was a strange kind of comfort in that isolation. On this particular night, the air felt heavier, almost electric. I followed my usual ritual. I opened the gate, drove inside, and closed it behind me. The dirt road stretched out before me like a dark vein, leading me to the farmhouse. But just as I was about to settle in, a primal growl shattered the night. It was different this time. The dogs were no longer friendly. They were agitated. Their hackles rose and their eyes glinted with something I couldn't see. It sent a shiver down my spine. I stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at my skin. "What is it, boy?" I called out. But they were already gone, sprinting into the darkness like arrows released from a bow. Heart racing, I grabbed the sidearm I kept in the glove compartment. The world felt surreal, the shadows thickening around me as I jumped into the driver's seat. With a quick honk of the horn, I urged the workers from their rooms. Dust billowed behind me as I sped after the dogs, who dashed ahead, barking frantically. I cursed under my breath, adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Wake up, guys!" I yelled, desperation creeping into my voice. "Something's out here!" As I chased the pack, the dirt road blurred beneath my tires. The dogs turned sharply, and I followed their lead until we reached the old abandoned house at the far end of the property. Its silhouette loomed against the night sky, a forgotten relic of a time long past. I skidded to a stop, taking cover behind my car, the gun heavy in my grip. "What the hell is happening?" I muttered to myself, straining to hear the growls that filled the night. The dogs were in a frenzy now, barking as if they had cornered their prey. I was sure it was a robber, maybe someone looking to steal from my friends. "No one's getting past me," I said, trying to convince myself of my bravery. Just then, I saw the workers emerge from their rooms, standing under the dim light like deer caught in headlights. "Call it off!" one of them shouted, fear lacing his voice. I couldn't believe it. "Are you guys serious? There's a thief out here!" "Let it go! It's not a robber!" the head worker yelled back, his voice rising. "What do you mean?" I barked, frustration boiling over. "We have to." "It's a ghost," he said, voice low and trembling. "This house is haunted. You need to back off." A cold chill snaked its way down my spine, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. "What? A ghost?" I laughed, trying to mask my unease. "That's just a story to scare kids." "No, it's true," he insisted, panic evident in his tone. "The dogs see things we can't. They know." The air turned still, an unnatural quiet settling over the scene. I looked at the dogs, their bodies tense and their growls deepening. I felt utterly foolish, yet adrenaline still coursed through me. "Cowards!" I shouted at the workers, feeling invincible despite the fear gnawing at my gut. "You're scared of a ghost?" But my bravado melted away as I watched the dogs dart into the darkness, pursuing whatever had set them off. I remained crouched behind the car, the tension thickening the air. My heart pounded in my chest like a war drum, and I fought the urge to flee. Suddenly, the dogs stopped dead in their tracks, tails tucked and eyes wide with terror. A low growl rumbled from the shadows, and I felt the hair on my neck stand up. Something was out there, something I couldn't see. "Guys," I called, my voice barely above a whisper, but they stood frozen, eyes fixed on the darkness. "What is it?" Then from the corner of my eye, I caught movement, something flickering just beyond the old house. My breath hitched. It looked almost human, yet so wrong, as if the shadows were playing tricks on my mind. I felt a primal instinct to flee, but the sight of the dogs, now trembling, anchored me in place. "What do you see?" I shouted, my voice wavering. "Nothing," they shouted back, but the fear in their eyes said otherwise. I could see it in their faces. They were witnessing something I was not. The sound of scratching echoed like fingernails on wood. "Please, just come back," I shouted at the dogs, but they didn't move, frozen in a state of terror. Then the figure flickered again, darting around the edge of the house. "Get back! Get back!" I yelled, my heart racing. I raised my gun, but my hands trembled. The dogs growled, a chorus of voices blending into a cacophony of fear. And then it happened. The figure burst into view, pale and ethereal, its face twisted in an expression of pure anguish. I gasped, stumbling back. The dogs howled, a sound filled with terror that echoed into the night. "Get in the car!" I yelled at the workers, my voice breaking. I scrambled for my keys, hands shaking as I fumbled them. The workers were still rooted to the spot, eyes wide in horror. "Call it off!" the head worker shouted again, but I couldn't comprehend him. I was already in the car, slamming the door shut. My heart raced as I reversed, barely keeping my eyes off the figure that flickered in and out of view. I sped away from that place, leaving the shadows behind. The last thing I heard before the darkness swallowed me was the dogs barking in unison, a desperate chorus chasing the unseen horror. Later, when I spoke with my friends, they confirmed the legend of that old house. Haunted. The dogs could sense things we couldn't, things that had no place in the living world. I never went back to that farm. The shadows haunted me long after I left, and to this day, I can't shake the feeling that something still lurks in the darkness, just waiting for another chance to be seen. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.